Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're now in our second season and more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. We look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and more will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on energy production, the good, the bad, the ugly, as it relates to health. Energy use is central to human society, and it provides many health benefits as well as many health hazards and negative impacts. Virtually everyone around the world is exposed to some level of outdoor and or indoor air pollution resulting from fuel combustion as a result of energy production and consumption. New research from Harvard University, in collaboration with the University of Birmingham, the University of Leicester, and University College of London, found that more than 8 million people died in 2018 from fossil fuel pollution, which is significantly higher than previous research suggested, meaning that air pollution from burning fossil fuels like coal and diesel and other petroleum products was responsible for about 1 in 5 deaths worldwide. The study, entitled Global Mortality from Outdoor Fine Particle Pollution Generated by Fossil Fuel Combustion, that was published in the Environmental Research Journal, is based on a groundbreaking analysis that enabled researchers to directly attribute premature deaths from fine particulate pollutions to fossil fuel combustion. And this has been speculated for a while, and now they've been able to truly connect it. The authors of the study said, we hope that by quantifying the health consequences of fossil fuel combustion, we can send a very, very clear message to policymakers, stakeholders, and everyday folks of the benefit of a transition to alternative energy sources. The key findings of the study, which of course underscore the detrimental impact of fossil fuels on global health, include the fact that worldwide air pollution from burning fossil fuels is responsible, again, for about 1 in 5 deaths, and that's roughly the population of New York City. It found that in the United States, 350,000 premature deaths are attributable to fossil fuel pollution, and that the highest number of deaths per capita were in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Minnesota, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, Illinois, New Jersey, and Wisconsin. It found that transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy has immediate health benefits, including preventing that premature deaths that we talked about. It found that exposure to particulate matter from fossil fuels accounted for about 21.5% of total deaths in 2012, falling to 18% of total deaths in 2018 due to tightening air quality measures in China. And it found that thousands of kids under the age of 5 die each year due to respiratory infections attributable to fossil fuel pollution. And this is a lot. Here today to help us begin to unpack this and understand it more is Dr. Seth Shonkoff. Seth is with Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy, which is one of our premier energy science and policy research institutes. Seth is Executive Director of, and we'll use the initials so I don't have to say all those words, he is Executive Director of PSE for Healthy Energy. He is also a visiting scholar in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley, and an affiliate in the Environment Energy Technology area at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. As an environmental and public health scientist by training, Seth has more than 20 years of experience in water, air, climate, and population health research at the Energy Interface, and he's published more than 50 peer-reviewed journal articles and reports. As well, Seth has testified before Congress and other decision-making bodies, as well as led and co-authored multiple scientific assessments. Seth has completed his PhD in environmental science policy and management and his master's in epidemiology in the School of Public Health from UC Berkeley. Welcome, Seth. Did I get all that right?
You did. Thank you, Bernice.
Thank you for being here. We're very happy that you could join us today. Seth, we want to start out by you talking to us about which energy sectors you see that pose the greatest opportunity for improvements in human health. Along with that, which or what are some of the biggest health benefits to those opportunities?
Yeah, so that's a good question. You know, if we look at the United States as a whole, transportation, electricity, and industrial, all three of those sectors account for the majority of emissions of both greenhouse gases, which drive climate change, public health, major public health concern, as well as co-emissions of health-damaging air pollutants such as particulate matter, ozone precursors, and a variety of hazardous air pollutants. So addressing those three sectors is, of course, of utmost importance. But from a health perspective, I think it's really important to understand that unlike greenhouse gas emissions, which can be emitted from anywhere on the globe and you know, have the same impact on the climate, health-damaging air pollutants and exposure to them happen at the local and regional levels. So even though I say, you know, we should go after the transportation, electricity generation, and industrial sectors as a whole, there's quite a bit of room for strategic planning on what you transition first. So, for example, communities living near a peaker power plant with high emissions per megawatt hour, those people might be benefited most by taking that offline as opposed to a peaker plant further away.
Okay. We here in North Texas have been under clean air standards non-attainment for 15 years and going. And so during that season, we have the ozone season. And while a lot of people may not understand all of it, probably everybody here knows the term ozone. And you used the term when you were talking about some of the areas for opportunity and improvement. You said ozone precursors. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so ozone precursors are emissions that come from a variety of sources, including but not limited to the combustion of fossil fuels. And many of these are volatile organic compounds. They're compounds, some of which are health damaging themselves, and some of which are not health damaging. But in the atmosphere, in the presence of sunlight and higher temperatures, they can produce smog, with the more technical term ozone. And this is a strong respiratory irritant. It's heavily regulated and can also decrease the ability to see long distances. It gives the air that sort of smoggy.
That hazy look.
Yeah.
And we only have a couple of minutes before we need to go to break, Seth. We're trying to do the sections, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we're on the good. And so let me ask you that and talk to us in the next minute or so. What is the good about energy production as it relates to health?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, more cleaner forms of energy, renewable energy such as solar and wind, if it's displacing fossil energy, really will reduce emissions of health-damaging air pollutants that disproportionately kill and harm the health of people nearby.
Thank you so much. We've been with Dr. Seth Shonkoff with UC Berkeley, and we're going to go to break now, and we'll be right back on the other side for him to tell us more about his exciting work. Thank you. We want to give a shout-out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV service. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many other locations, as well as available online, free for download at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Hayden Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral and Medicine Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. To today's show on energy production, the good, the bad, and the ugly as it relates to health. And we are back now with Dr. Seth Shonkoff, with physicians, scientists, and engineers for healthy energy, as well as he's with UC Berkeley. Again, welcome back, Seth. Thank you so much for joining us. We talked about what seems to be the very little good as it relates to energy production surrounding health issues. So let's move on to some of the bad and the ugly. Which energy sectors pose the greatest threat to human health?
You know, in the last segment, I talked about the sectors where there's the most possibility for reducing emissions and reducing exposure of human populations to those air pollutants. And really, the story is very similar for which sectors pose the highest risk to human health with respect to energy, and that's the transportation, electricity generation, and industrial sectors. You know, there's a few take-home messages we can take from looking at this issue. One is that there are some communities that are disproportionately exposed to air pollutants and chemicals from these sectors, and those are communities that are the host to a number of the emission sources. These communities tend to be disproportionately lower income, tend to be disproportionately communities of color. And if you're talking about where to start, the answer is to start in these higher impacted communities.
And would you say that the vulnerable communities are more impacted because of the location of the emitters, or what?
Yeah, oftentimes it comes down to the physical proximity to the emission source. Communities that live right next to a freeway, for example, are disproportionately exposed to diesel particulate matter. Communities that live near oil and gas development, so where they produce oil and gas, are disproportionately exposed to chemicals and air pollutants emitted from those sources. And there's a deep and growing body of epidemiological literature that suggests that, for example, birth outcomes are more poor around where oil and gas is produced.
In line with that, Seth, I also want to talk to you a little bit about the history of household energy use trends, because that's going to affect a wider swath of people. And I think people have to understand that, because if people tend to think that, oh, the issue only affects this one group, then it causes them not to have empathy or not to realize they must be concerned too. So, given that, talk to us a little bit about the history of household energy trends, how they've changed, and how that impacts health.
Yeah. So, 100 years ago or so, or, maybe a little bit longer, depending on where you are in the United States, the majority of energy sources used to cook, to heat homes, et cetera, were from solid biomass. So things like coal and wood and charcoal. And solid biomass is the worst for health. The emissions that come off of burning solid biomass, especially indoors, include particulate matter and a variety of other very health-damaging constituents. And over the past century or so, the United States and many parts of the world have gone through a general energy transition model. Whereas countries and communities become more affluent, they burn less of this biomass and move more towards natural gas and electricity to meet their energy needs. And in general, cooking with gas and cooking with electricity, heating your home with gas and electricity is more healthy than heating your home with wood and coal. That said, there's a growing body of scientific literature that's been looking very carefully at emission sources inside of homes, and indoor air quality is always more concerning than outdoor air quality because emissions accumulate into higher concentrations of health-damaging constituents. And one of the main takeaways from this body of literature is that the gas stove in particular, and possibly other gas appliances, are really contributing to a high indoor air pollution burden. In particular, emissions of nitrogen oxides and formaldehyde while cooking accumulate and reach beyond our national ambient air quality standards, which are federally regulated, within a matter of minutes sometimes. And this is especially the case in smaller homes and less well-ventilated homes.
Yeah, I've learned unequivocally since starting the show that, as they tell me, anything that burns, anything that combusts is creating pollution. Then the other thing I've learned, I like this, we actually put something out on our social media, is that the solution for air pollution is dilution. I love it.
That's right. And you will not find a whole lot of dilution indoors, and that's why the problem exists and persists.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the relationship between energy use and climate change? And then, is there any correlation between energy use and/or production and COVID-19? So first climate change and then COVID.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to climate change, energy is a double-edged sword because on the one hand, the forms of energy that have led us to this climate crisis, namely coal, oil, and gas, are the reason why we're in this predicament. On the other hand, in a climate changed world with more frequent and intense weather events and other disasters, access to reliable energy is the way that we protect ourselves. For example, if somebody is relying on an electronic medical device and a hurricane comes and wipes out the electricity grid and they no longer have access to electricity, they're not going to be able to use that device. And so there are constellations of technologies, many of which are clean, such as solar plus storage sited on the roof of a home, which can enable which can enable a home and communities at large maintain access to their power during these events and be more resilient in the face of climate change.
Indeed, and we're going to talk more on the second half of our show about technology as it relates to energy use as well. So, Seth, before we go, talk to us again a little bit about any correlation that we might have between COVID and energy use or energy production.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say, much more than I could explore in the next 2 minutes. But there's no denying that COVID has changed our energy landscape, at least temporarily, and likely far-reaching into the future. COVID has literally kept people in place, which means that they are not driving, they're not flying on planes, we're not heating offices in the same way, and all of the energy load has been shifted to, or much of the energy load has been shifted to the residential sector. This has changed the economics of energy. It's changed the economics of oil, what people are willing to do to get oil out of the ground when the price of oil is this low. It is also opening up opportunities for car manufacturers, for example, to see where the trends are going. GM just announced a week or so ago that by 2025, they're going to have 30 electric vehicle models rolled out globally, and that 40% of all of their cars that are going to hit the road by 2025 will be electric. The state of California recently announced an executive order that said that they will not allow gas-powered vehicles to be sold in the state beyond 2035. And COVID has changed the price signal. It's shifted the market in ways that we were going already. There's no denying that the clean energy transition has been coming and increasingly rapidly over the past number of years. COVID just made it clear that things are moving at a quicker clip. And I think that, companies like General Motors, them adding $7 billion to their $20 billion investment is specifically because of how things have sped up and the transportation landscape looks different as we've taken a step back during COVID.
As well as the vividly demonstrated changes in air quality due to COVID and folks staying at home. Thank you so much. We have been with Dr. Seth Shonkoff with the Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy. And you all do great work there. That's a really important area of research and conversation. And we look forward to you being back on the show later in the season. Thank you so much. We're going to go to break, and after that, we will continue with part 2 of our show, where we talk with Dr. Melissa Lott. We'll look at policy as well as some of the other things related to technology and energy. Thank you so much. We'll be right back with part 2 on the other side. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now on part 2 of our show on energy production, the good, the bad, the ugly, as it relates to health. As we know for sure, we've been talking about it on the first part of our show, and we experienced it, that energy use is absolutely central to human activity for preparing food, warming homes, powering travel, and producing goods, among many, many other purposes. The history of human culture, as one historian wrote, can be viewed as a progressive development of new energy sources and their associated conversion technology. Indeed, the control of wood fires for cooking arguably is a fundamental transformation that made humans distinct from other primates. And then later, water and wind were tapped as energy sources. Burning animal products, such as whale oil, was important for a time. And then modern history brought the use of coal and later natural gas, oil, and nuclear power. And of course, contemporary societies mirror this history. Total energy use is related to population growth and economic output. We can say that and see that for sure. The amount of energy used, as well as the quality of energy, drives economic productivity. More efficient and flexible energy sources are associated with higher productivity. Human-engendered climate change, however, is largely, but not entirely, caused by energy use. And of course, it's already imposing significant health impacts across all populations, and particularly among poor populations. Health impacts from climate change can be expected to grow steadily in the next decades. And other energy sources, such as nuclear, also carry some risk as well as health impacts from the most new and the newer renewable sources. Even though the impacts are likely to be smaller, they're still going to be there. Again, this is important stuff, and we want to explore it more and unpack it. And here today to help us do that is Dr. Melissa Lott with Columbia University. Melissa is research director at the Center for Global Energy Policy, where she leads the power sector and the Renewables Research Initiative. She's worked as an engineer and advisor for more than 15 years in the United States, Europe, and Asia, and she's a Texan. Melissa specializes in technology and policy research, working to increase our understanding of the impacts of our energy systems on air pollution and public health. She has authored more than 350 scientific articles, columns, op-eds, journal publications, and reports. Melissa holds a degree from the University of Texas at Austin, which is my alma mater, with a master's in science and engineering and a master of public affairs. And she has her PhD from the University College in London. And she has interned at the White House Council on Environmental Quality under President Obama. Welcome, Melissa, and did I get all of that right?
Did, and thanks, Bernice. And I'll say, just because I know you had Seth on earlier, I got my undergrad degree in Northern California at University of California, Davis. So,
all right.
Family. We've lived on every coast.
She really has, a woman of the world. Melissa, before I get into some of the other questions that I have to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, I've been told that a life cycle approach to evaluating energy sources is important in order to fully understand the health and climate costs and benefits of energy production across the production, storage, transport, and in-use processes. Why is that important? Help us understand that.
No, so life cycles, what it means is that we're going to look at not just one moment in time in the life of a certain type of fuel or certain technology, but we're going to take into account every step along the way. And this is really important because what it prevents us from doing accidentally is actually just outsourcing problems, moving them somewhere else, as opposed to actually solving them. And there's a lot of different ideas you can have around this. One is around electric vehicles, and this is an example that people like to use a lot. The actual climate impact and air pollution impact of an electric vehicle, where you're sitting, nothing's coming out of your tailpipe. You're just going around with clean electricity. But where did that electricity come from? It may still be better overall than your diesel vehicle, but it's important to understand that it's not a complete solution unless it's also powered with zero pollution, zero carbon energy, electricity in this case. So this is why we need to understand the entire picture, not just one instance in time.
Thank you so much for that user-friendly explanation, Melissa. So start out, though, by telling our listeners about some of the most recent energy policy achievements and advancements, both nationally and globally, and why should people know about this, and most of all, why should they care about it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff going on right now, and I'll kind of take this question and I'll say there's policies that have been passed and that have been enacted more recently in the United States and globally. So we can go and look at the Paris Agreement, which is an international agreement of saying, you know what, we're going to act on climate change. This is a big deal. Most of it's non-binding. It doesn't actually force us to do anything, but it's having countries get together and say, this is important and we're going to do something. And that kind of leadership is important. But one thing I'll flag is actually conversations here in the U.S. that we're having right now with the incoming Biden-Harris administration that just came in. And there's a big conversation around how much faster should we be moving when it comes to transitioning, particularly our energy systems moving forward. So I know that during the campaign and since they've come into office, since inauguration, the administration has flagged that, hey, we want to have 100% of our electricity coming from clean sources by 2035, which is really a blink of an eye when you're talking about energy infrastructure. That's very soon. And then they said by mid-century, we want to be looking at net zero carbon. How do we get there? And what do we need to do in terms of investments? So there's other policies that people talk about, different types of subsidies and tax credits that we've passed over the past decade. There's some big acts. Certainly, if you go back, further in time, you can look at the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act, which have had huge impacts on how energy and the energy sector is developed. But I'm really excited to see what we do here in the next few years, because the impacts of that are going to be far-reaching for the coming decades that we're all going to be living through if we're lucky.
Indeed. And again, I tell everybody I talked to recently, too, it didn't hurt that about 5 days into the new administration is their announcement that Seth had talked about earlier.
Absolutely. There's a lot of different companies who have been making some exciting announcements. And I'll say even before, the election was clear and the results were in, you had companies like Microsoft and Google coming out and saying, you know what, in the case of Google, we've done a lot in terms of decarbonizing our electricity for our, the different data centers that we operate in our office buildings. We're going a step further, and we're going to set the standard for future commitments from corporations. We're going to 24/7, 365. And then Microsoft, talked about, we're not just going to solve our emissions going further. We're going to get rid of the emissions we already put into the air. That was a big one. And they set a new standard there. So there's a lot of exciting action happening around corporations, both before and after the new administration came in.
Indeed. Melissa, let me ask you, what would you say has been some of the better things or the best things that citizens, ordinary people or humans, have experienced related to health as it relates to our energy production and energy consumption recently? And that may tie in, too, with perhaps having it so that ball will not stop rolling.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things that we in our households, in our lives every day have benefited from when it comes to the energy system. And backing up a minute, overall there are trade-offs with energy. No one denies that. There's air pollution, there's water use in water-stressed areas, there's all kinds of trade-offs. But overall, having access to modern energy services, so I think Seth talked about it, moving from burning, charcoal to cook to actually using electricity or even gas with its trade-offs, these things are good for health. This is overall good for health. So when it comes to our everyday lives, we have seen a bunch of different things happen across the United States because of hydraulic fracturing, which again comes with trade-offs, including air pollution ones. We have seen decreasing use of coal, which is a more carbon-intense and more pollution-intense resource. We have seen increasing deployment of renewables thanks to declining costs, which if you look back in policy, a lot of that comes from investments that were made in research and development and innovation many years ago, and now we're reaping the benefits. And in terms of that ball rolling down the hill, when things get cheap, they start deploying, even if you don't have a comprehensive policy. And that's what we're seeing in the country.
Exactly. Indeed, it makes a difference. It's kind of like cigarette smoking. When people have been smoking for years and they stop smoking and they see how healthy their lungs feel, how fast they can walk or run or whatever, that's an impact that scientists say really serves to keep them in that not smoking state. And so hopefully we can see some health-related or other societal impacts that just keep us going down that road, help us continue to roll that ball down the road toward a cleaner energy future. Thank you. We're going to go to break now, and we'll be back on the other side again with Dr. Melissa Lott with the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods grocers, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available online free for download at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsors, Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body and none mercury. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on energy production, the good, the bad, and the ugly on health. And we are back with Dr. Melissa Lott, a Texan who is research director at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University in New York. Again, thank you so much for being able to join us today, Melissa.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Melissa, you were telling us about technological advances as it relates to the energy sector. Are there some promising ones that are on the horizon that maybe people want to know about, get ready for, or just get excited about?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of different technologies that are getting very exciting. So I can break it down in terms of supply and demand.
Right.
On the supply side, when we look at power plants or when we look at industry, which Seth flagged is, an area of a lot of opportunity that we have not tapped into yet, in large part, and also transportation. We're seeing cost declines across electric vehicles coming down very rapidly. Some of that is about battery technology. It's also about lighter materials in vehicles, actually making it so that, lighter cars that are still strong and safe for us to ride in, that can decrease the amount of energy we need to actually move down the road. So we're seeing lots of exciting technologies there. On the supply side, we're seeing carbon capture and storage technologies actually becoming feasible. And this is really important if we want to have a low-cost and reliable electricity system. Something that's really interesting in the research, and this isn't something I knew day one when I started in my research. I was like, oh, wind, sun, and a battery. That's enough, right? Like I can have 24/7 electricity off of that, and it'll be cheap. Just need a battery. Reality is, unfortunately, in a lot of the world and most of the U.S., we have periods of time that are longer than hours and overnight or even a few days when the sun isn't shining brightly and the wind isn't blowing a lot. Even in California, you have 2-week periods where the wind just isn't blowing strongly. And so you got to fill it with other things. So carbon capture technologies, advanced nuclear technologies, and other types of zero carbon fuels like hydrogen, they're coming along, and I would say more quickly than I expected. And these are things to keep an eye on.
Two things I want to unpack a little more that you addressed, and that is, would you explain to our listeners what carbon capture is? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give a lot of credit of my knowledge around this to a couple of different people. One is Julio Friedman at the Center on Global Energy Policy, Dr. Julio Friedman, and Dr. Stuart Cohen, who's now at the National Renewable Energy Lab. They are my go-to people when I want to learn more about the technologies behind carbon capture. But effectively what it says is that, okay, right now we burn things in power plants and we produce greenhouse gases. Well, what if we don't let those greenhouse gases out of the power plant? What if we grab them and we put them back underground or put them into some kind of a storage system? We can also use them for other things. We can use those molecules for other applications, but it's about actually scrubbing it out before it goes into the air and gets away from us and putting it somewhere and saying, okay, we've captured it in one place. It's not going to contribute to the greenhouse effect. That's how those technologies work. And some you capture it before you actually burn stuff. Some you capture it after, which is really fascinating chemistry and science.
It is. You know what I'm seeing in my mind's eye, Melissa, is like you put a balloon over a smokestack. And that smoke the smoke that comes out of it goes into the balloon. You take it and you wind it up and you bury it. It's like capture.
Slightly different, but that's a great image.
Yeah, a very crude image of carbon capture. Because I do want people to understand that you're talking about capturing it before it gets into the environment and the atmosphere.
Absolutely. And in this case, it's interesting because when I say the word pipelines, people think about oil and gas and like moving stuff, Keystone XL, these types of things. When you capture carbon, you need to move it somewhere, and that involves pipelines that put it in these underground salt caverns and other things. It's fascinating.
Second thing I want to dig into more that you mentioned, and that is storage of renewables like wind and solar. Because too often I become perturbed when I hear that factor of storage, or you can't have wind energy because the wind doesn't blow all the time, or you can't do solar energy. I can't use that because the sun doesn't shine every time. And so that's used as a false, I think, a false reason against it. Talk a little bit about that storage capacity and what's been done.
Overall, one of the things that ends up being, I call it a false narrative, is where we isolate things out and say, well, let me look at this one technology operating in isolation and see if it can solve the world. And I'm like, guys, that's not actually what we're talking about doing. We're talking about taking a huge integrated system, one of the biggest machines we've ever created, and transitioning it to be more sustainable. And so within that, if you look at all the studies, all the scenarios put out by all the different organizations, there's three things you need to have an affordable transition to a zero carbon system that is as reliable or more reliable than what we have today. So the lights are staying on, and that's a combination of variable renewables, so that's wind and solar, these things that are extremely cheap when we have them now because we bring down the cost, but they're not there all the time. Energy storage, so batteries, but also longer-term storage. So different materials that we can store heat in. There's lots of different options. Also fuels like hydrogen. And then the third one is firm dispatchable zero-carbon power. And what that means is power that is there 24/7, 365 whenever I need it, but is not emitting these emissions that I don't want. So if you have a combination of those three things, you end up with a cheap transition to zero carbon, relatively. We can keep power prices really stable. If you lose one of those three things, it's kind of like a three-legged stool and you kicked out a leg, things get uncomfortable real fast. And so that's really, storage is an important leg, but it's not the whole thing. Neither are wind and solar.
Yeah. And a couple more questions. We've got about 3 minutes before we need to end this segment. And that is, how has technology, though, hurt us, perhaps, or not served us well in the energy sector?
Yes, I mean, there are clear sets of evidence, and Seth went through a few of them, that show us the trade-offs associated with energy. So on balance, having these modern energy services is very good for us, but they produce pollution that kills hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. and millions of people globally every year. This is a problem. We've got more kids with asthma. We've got people not living the long and healthy life we'd want them to live. We've got elderly people going blind earlier than they would have because of all these health effects associated with air pollution. And the energy sector is not only, and when I say energy sector, I mean power plants, cars, industry, all those things. The energy sector is not only the source of the majority of greenhouse gas emissions around the world, but also other key types of air pollution.
Indeed. So what are some of the negatives or downsides of our predominant renewable energy sources? And then nuclear. I know nuclear is not a renewable per se, but people like to call it a clean energy, but I think that's debatable or arguable. But negatives or downside of wind and solar and nuclear.
Yeah, so I mean, with nuclear power, the obvious one that jumps out to me, because I'm a Texan but also lived in California during a period of my life, is water use. Nuclear power uses a ton of water. This puts a lot of strain on things. And when you're making trade-offs between, okay, I've got to cool a nuclear power plant, or I've got to irrigate my fields, or I've got to not have a shower every day. I mean, these are very real trade-offs. And I know in California, we've felt this. In Texas, we feel droughts. The trade-off of it is, without nuclear power or firm dispatchable electricity, you end up with higher power prices. You end up with having air pollution because you're trading it off for a natural gas plant or a coal plant. I mean, these are very real trade-offs. Other things that we see is, like with renewables, we're using a lot more land. We're using a lot more land to actually put those solar panels out and those wind turbines out. There's a great study, though, from another Texan, Joshua Rhodes at UT Austin's Energy Institute, that covers, okay, how much land are we using for wind in like West Texas, and what are the local economic benefits to that? Because that's a really interesting conversation. Wind turbines use a ton of land. We can still graze cows around them. Solar fields, we don't like to do that so much because it's real expensive to get them high enough off the ground to keep the cows able to, graze around them, and then also to have the sunshine, still have the grass grow. So these are some of the trade-offs we see. And also on the life cycle point you brought up at the very beginning, solar and wind are not actually emission-free today. And the materials that go into them are not emission-free. Like, there are still emissions associated with them. And you have to think about every material that goes into that solar panel. Where does it come from? What are the trade-offs? I think the big word in energy transitions is trade-offs, and you have to pick the set of trade-offs you're willing to accept, because every single thing has trade-offs.
Exactly. And like you said, those other two have some emissions, albeit the emissions are not as great as those caused by combustion. But I have to think that there is future work to be done on the health effects of those emissions. For example, there could be much less, but they could be more harmful. So again, much more work to be done.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, on the research side, it is completely strongly true in the evidence that we want to decarbonize the energy system. We want to move to wind and solar and carbon capture and storage around natural gas power plants, all these clean zero carbon sources. That is better for our health than what we're doing today. Even when you look at all the life cycle stuff, the trade-off is actually, it's a pretty easy decision. And you want to do it as quickly as possible. We just need the leadership and the policies to get us there as quickly as we can, because every year we wait to move, we end up having more people having shorter lives and less healthy lives. And that's also very clear in the evidence. The last thing I'll say is you mentioned the Harvard study out this morning. The other study I'd point people to who want to look at this was also out today, which is in the Lancet Planetary Health. And it's a study saying if we decarbonize and we actually meet like our Paris Agreement targets, how many fewer people will die every year because of air pollution, because of unhealthy diets, and because of less active lifestyles. So there's a lot of good analysis in that as well. And I think it was CNN that picked up and did a double story with both studies in it. So maybe that's a good bang for your buck story if you want to check out those studies.
Indeed. I really think that study is significant because, again, we talk about it a lot, but it actually vividly shows. So Thank you so much, Melissa. We really appreciate you being with us. We've been with Dr. Melissa Lott, a Texan, who is research director at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And she has actually helped us quite a bit to understand what's going on in energy production as it relates to our health and policy. Again, thank you. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplace, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is the result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourself. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up one way or the other to the change we each live through. This is Bernice Butler, your host. Thank you, and join us again next week for more Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio.